done it.
Done it? You
I've
got it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Cool.
and now I'm going to make Milou the host.
That's a game.
How do I do that? Make host. Make Milou the host. So I'm just admitting Yvonne. Change host.
Oh, you're getting all the people coming through now?
Yeah. Now it'll go to Milou. So if you get any more,
Milou.
you have to let them in.
All right.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi, Yvonne.
Hey, Yvonne.
Yes, I arrived. Sorry.
It's all right. So we've got Claire. Hello, Claire. Hello, Millie. Hello, Alex. Hello, Dan.
Hello.
Is that it?
Hello.
Hi.
So I'm on my phone, so I've got to slide across to see if anybody ever knows.
Have we got any more in the waiting room, Milou, or should we start?
Doesn't look like it.
Just got a cup of tea.
Water.
Okay, should we start? My name is Ray Malone. I'm the creative coordinator of the English Masquerade, a year-long heritage project about 18th century molly houses and mollies. Today, Milou is going to be talking about the English Masquerade and influences, European influences. Oh wow, we've got Arkham in a mask. Amazing.
See that? I can't see.
You can see Arkham.
Oh, woo!
Nice.
Hello.
Nice. Hi. Okay, so Milou, I'm just going to pass straight over to you because I know that you've got a PowerPoint presentation and you're going to talk to us about European influences and the construction of gender in the English Masquerade.
Yes.
So yeah, take it from here.
Yes. So first I'm going to introduce myself. As Ray said, yes, I am Milou Stella. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm half French, half Italian, multidisciplinary artist and facilitator based in London. I studied painting, but began to explore embroidery and recycled textiles as a medium a few years ago. The politics and history behind textiles and craft are probably a major factor as to why I'm so interested in the medium, and have since been interested in art and craft as an act of resistance and of protest. I've been facilitating community-oriented workshops at the Create Place, which is part of Sir Margaret's house, for the past 3 years through a workshop called Embroidery for Wellbeing. I also facilitate the Embroidery Loop in the same place, which is a free social event for textile lovers. And I'm currently lead one online too, supported by the Arts Council and in partnership with Sir Margaret's House, which is called the Creative Resistance Craft Club, in short, CRCK. I regularly teach hand embroidery and sustainability workshops at Fabrications in Broadway Market, which is also East London. And I've been involved in outreach participatory projects with Poplar Union, Poplar Harker, ELAT, which is a Hackney Learning Trust, and Rich Mix, and have been bringing embroidery workshops to service users in East London. If you're interested in knowing more, please do get in contact, or you can check my website, which is Moody Bright Designs, or my artist's website, which is still under construction, but which is miloustella.com. Obviously, I'm on Instagram, so you can also find me at Moody Bright Designs and at miloustella_art. So my role within the Molly's Masquerade is going to be to facilitate some workshops and using embroidery as a medium. And I will be talking about embroidery throughout the presentation. Hopefully I'll be working in archives, some London archives, and I will be kind of either mapping or looking into the spaces that the Mollies would have inhabited during the 18th century London and East London in particular. For this reason, as I'm going to go and show you the presentation, I've tried to create a little journey with visual references that can give a bit more of a sense of the kind of world that the Mollies inhabited and how all of these elements worked with each other. But I am not a historian, and I am actually not an expert in decorative arts. So, you know, I'm going to try and do my best, but it's been really interesting. So we've got the presentation starting now. And we start with the first image, which is actually an image of London towards the end of the 17th century. And as you can see, well, it's big. There's a lot of buildings. It's not as trafficked as you would imagine now, but I was quite surprised to find it. What I want to point out, even if it's very small, and I understand that it's only kind of like, what's the word, suggestive in this moment, is that we can see old Spitalfields on the right-hand side, which we're definitely going to be talking about. We've got more fields, a little bit more towards the centre and north, which we're going to be talking about. We've got the big arteries of London's sort of trades, streets and roads, which are very important when it comes to the Mollies, because as we have mentioned in some of the previous Zooms, the Mollies were lower class people. They often met close to where they worked, and at the same time would have been trading with the richer side of the city. So they would have been going back and forth east and west to some extent. So it's really interesting to just for a second zoom in, zoom out into London, and now we're going to slowly zoom in. With looking at actually some of the places that the Mollies would have walked in. Right, so here we have the Royal Exchange, and these two illustrations and prints, they're showing the second Royal Exchange that was built after the Great Fire of London. And it's important to look at it because some of the elements, some of the stock and fabric and things that would have been used to make the costumes for the masquerade, or would have been the trade of some of the Mollies, they would have been at the Royal Exchange. They would have been like trading there. They would have been like wandering around meeting people. So it's interesting to see what they looked like, and it's interesting to see how busy they were already. In some of the chapters of the book on the Mollies by Richter Norton, they do talk about as well how it was a place for walking and meeting people for the Mollies as well. Here we've got the London's Haymarket. Again, it's important because that's where you could buy a ticket to go to a masquerade. And the London's Haymarket's masquerades were the cheapest masquerades you could go and attend if you wanted to. I think you could buy one at the time for 3 shillings. Yes, and it's also where loads of operas inspired by the Italian opera would have been put on. And as we know, there was a close link between the London Masquerade and the Mollies, and the theatricality of this period, together with the theatre and the plays that were being put at the time. So we're kind of I'm trying to show you through visual references a little bit of what it looked like to be in London at this point. Here I also added Vauxhall Gardens, another famous location for London's masquerade. Vauxhall Gardens masquerades were a little bit more expensive. Here a little bit more cheaper. In fact, there was 1 shilling that you could go to, and in the various films of the based in the 18th century, you can actually see what it looked like to be in these places, whether it was promenading, walking, cruising, gossiping, looking for intrigue, finding entertainment, any of these possibilities. This is the environment that we would have been in. I'm kind of really fascinated at looking how green it is. It's not something that we can see so much these days, but you can also see how artificial and how constructed it is. This is a time of quite opulent style, both in architecture and in dress. And you can see a little bit through the architecture and how constructed everything is, how these spaces were meant for urban expression or urban life. I also found this illustration of St. James's Park of the time. I've got a little caption there. A prospect of St. James's Park, looking down the moor with a canal to the right and a formal garden with a pool and a fountain in the foreground. The River Thames, St. Paul's Cathedral and numerous church spires are visible in the distance and are the distant hills. Now, the reason why I'm showing all of these different places is so that you get a sense of where the Mollys walked, where the aristocrats went cruising. St. James's was the area with loads of macaronis, which were men of the 18th century who wore a very extravagant, exaggerated style, who loved hanging out in St. James's, and some studies suggest that it's in these areas that loads of cruising for gays and people that are now belong to the LGBT community, but at the time didn't have such an identity, would have been looking for company or have had a social life. Pretty beautiful, I would say. But right, so I've showed you a few of the places, and I wanted to also show you perhaps some of the kind of workers and sellers and entertainers that would have been equally populating and inhabiting the spaces that I've showed you. These are woodcuts, another craft that was quite popular at the time, and a craft that's also based on Richard Norton's book, has been recorded as perhaps one of the professions and jobs that the Mollys or people who attended the Mollys houses would have done. So here I've got a man playing a tambour, and I had also a woman who is selling sheet music on the streets, which was a very popular trade at the time as well. Right, so now we're zooming in further into a masquerade situation. So this is an engraving and etching of William Hogarth, who has been...
To interrupt you, Milou, can you let Steffi in? There's somebody in the waiting room.
Yes. Oh, I don't see it. Okay, I need to stop the thing. Yeah. Okay, I've got it. Done.
Yeah.
Sorry. But good, tell me otherwise, because
Okay.
I don't even get a little notification.
Yeah.
But yes, so here we are, and we've got an etching illustrations from Hogarth. It's one of his earliest one. As we have mentioned in previous Zooms, there were strong moralistic voices that were commenting on society at this point. But if we just take away the moralistic attitude that existed at the time, what we can see here is literally an image of how popular the masquerade was. We've got people queuing on both sides to go and see an Italian opera. And I've got a little quote that describes it quite eloquently. So this is a satirical print ridiculing the reigning follies of fashionable London. At the center is a waste paper hawker whose barrow is filled with the great names of British literature: Shakespeare, Dryden, Congreve, Addison, and Otway. A reference to Pasquin, a figure associated with satire, has been scratched out. In subsequent impressions, it would be replaced by Ben Jonson's name. To either side, crowds flock to entertainment in bad taste. Among them are Burlington House in Piccadilly, sarcastically named the Academy of Arts, a conjuring display by the popular magician Isaac Fawkes, and a masquerade into which a crowd is ushered by a satyr and a fool. Italian opera is ridiculed in the figures of the fashionable opera singer Francesca Cuzzoni, Francesco Bernardi Senesino, and Gaetano Berenstadt, who are shown on a large banner performing Handel's Flavio. The verses at the foot of the sheet are printed from a separate plate. So what we can see here is the popularity of Italian opera, which is on the banner above. And we can also see some other characters that are quite interesting to me. at the balcony on the left side of the print, there's actually one of the most important figures when it comes to English Masquerade, someone called Heidegger. Now, Heidegger was an entrepreneur who brought the masquerade to England from France, and who saw an opportunity in basically making it a profitable business when the ambassador of Switzerland first set the first English Masquerade at Somerset House. So this Heidegger, to me, was an interesting human to follow through my research, because he is mentioned on multiple occasions through press, through illustrations, through books, and through plays. And this is a link, a strong link to the Mollies, because actually Heidegger and Mrs. Needham, which is mentioned by Victor Norton in the book about the Mollies and how close the Mollies and the sex workers and the prostitute live.
Is the old brothel owner, isn't she? Yeah.
Yes. One of the most important brothels in London at the time, and very close to Heidegger when it comes to satire, press and print. So we're kind of getting to know some of the characters that people at this time in London would have either ridiculed, known, or somewhat learned about or know about and judged, I reckon. So this is the outside of a masquerade, and now I'm interested in showing you what maybe the inside of the masquerade looked like. And let me see, there we go. So the masquerade is popular for basically almost 100 years, but it changes. In the first half, it's more sophisticated, aristocratic, and perhaps like adventurous. And towards the end, it becomes a little bit more, what's the word? People have become a little bit more bored towards it. And it becomes a little bit more decadent. It becomes a little bit more, stylized. Anyway, here on the inside of this print, we've got remarkable characters at Mrs. Cornelis Masquerade. Now, I was interested in finding out who Mr. Cornelis was, who is the successor. She's the successor of the role that Heidegger had in the first part of the century. And Mrs. Cornelis was an Italian opera singer as well, who was really close friends with Casanova. I think everybody in one way or the other remembers Casanova, knows of Casanova. So it's kind of interesting to see what it looked like from the inside. And we've got a series of characters. And again, I've got a little bit of a description for this image as well. Casanova and Teresa Cornelis, the remarkable characters. In this image, we see characters who identify as foreign, theatrical, and in some sense, other in comparison to the British Protestant elite. If you pay attention to it, you might be able to see a Turk, a nun, and the cast of the Commedia dell'arte. A number of the characters or costumes whose identities are situated outside the parameters of the strictly human too, such as a coffin costume embellished with death head symbols, a bear led by an organ grinder, and the ghoulish figure of Mad Tom of Bedlam. Mad Tom was a guise assumed by the character of Edgar in King Lear. It was also the title of a ballad first published in Thomas Durfey's Wit and Mirth in 1720. Now, the presence of death here in the form of a coffin was ubiquitous in the medieval Catholic carnival as a regenerative agent. In this image, however, the coffin costume also functions as a kind of vanitas symbol, reminding masquerade participants of the transience of human life. So it's a bit of a mockery of human condition, but we can see some of the worries of society through this. We can see a little bit about what they think, what in a way an element of society thinks about the masquerade, and we can see the foreign influences as well. This for me is fascinating because me being French Italian and the masquerade being hugely influenced by French Italian taste, I've been kind of curious to see what parallels can be created, and in a way what is fascinating is seeing how the English moralist of the time mostly blamed everything to do with the masquerade on foreigners. It's like very simple. I think I've got a quote for that. Let me see if I can find it. Just 1 second.
I'll jump in just on the chat, Stuart, that you talk about Therese Cornley's.
Yes, Cornelis.
This is the same person that Milou is going on about, and I've been fascinated by her for a long time.
Oh,
So please read the book, Empress of Pleasure. The reason she's so fascinating to me is because the clubs that she created, these evenings, these masquerades, they actually took place. If anyone knows Soho Square, if they know there's a church on a corner, that was the house where she ran her clubs, which were attended by royalty, and they're famous because they're the first time that actually bouncers happened. They were so popular that they needed bouncers, and also that people used to come to watch the people, like we do now with paparazzi. People used to come to watch all the celebrities and the royalty sneak in and arrive and dress up in their masquerade costumes. It was absolutely massive. And the really thing that's interesting about her is that she actually died in poverty. She died in prison because she wasn't good with her finances. So she created and she built all this extravagance, but then she actually died in prison. I can't remember which one, but it's a real rags to riches to rags story. And I actually loved her so much that when I went to Venice, I had to seek out where she lives and find it. And so I'm fascinated by her. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out.
Yes, and she was the first one who actually created tickets, like a membership ticket. You had to actually have a season ticket to go to all of the masquerade balls.
Absolutely, it was a massive deal. She had this female friend with her as well, and they used to judge who was kind of a bit like we do now, like they do now, who was cool enough to get a ticket. She's a fascinating character. And actually, I'm so glad she's come out in this because for me, she is another heritage project. And she's a musical. She's an absolute legend waiting to be discovered. So.
Yes, and I think the figure of all these different types of women with their own businesses, with their own entrepreneurial behavior, with their own like looking for opportunity, finding network, and just to add on top of this, traveling by themselves, unmarried, with a business, not speaking the language in 17th century is something that I really enjoyed discovering about. And I will be talking about this a little bit more when I talk about women in the profession of milliners and dressmaker and stuff like that. But so this was common. The women who were opera singers, who were like celebrities, who came from Italy and sang, they often were unmarried women. They were unmarried women that had basically a job and would have traveled.
Interrupting you. Can you let Dan de la Motte back in?
Apologies. It's because my thing doesn't show me. Let me see. 1 second. I got it. Yes, it's coming.
Can I just ask a question as well? Because you were saying before, like the masquerade, you know, in that like mock picture that you showed previously, the Hogarth.
Yes.
And it had all like the English writers' scripts in the middle and everybody is ignoring it and going in the masquerade.
Yes.
And the Italian operas would have been shown in the masquerade. Yes. Did you make the point that the masquerade was generally considered low art? But was opera considered low art? Was it the same status? Because now we see opera as like, you know, only
high art. No, definitely. I mean, the opera was definitely a pleasure that was enjoyed by many, but it wasn't considered to be necessarily such high art at the time, because some of the opera content was not necessarily, you know, it was vulgar. That's what you would use the word vulgar, meaning that it was for the people rather than being Latin, which would have been for the higher classes.
Stuart.
Well, so much about sex workers.
There was a massive scandal with Teresa when she actually bought opera into her parties. And they didn't like it. So yeah, so it wasn't the high art that we kind of thought it was, because it was included as part of her kind of nights, if you like.
Yeah.
Alex, did you say something?
Well, so many operas are about sex workers, and kind of at the time were quite transgressive about characters who weren't ever represented in story.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a couple of quotes. Masquerades were brilliantly festooned and illuminated rooms, and often lasted until early in the next morning. Food and drink were consumed in great quantities. Dancing, gaming, and bawdiness were the rule. So that's why it's really interesting to start looking at the interior and looking a little bit what it would have been like to be in these spaces. And like you said, Stu, it's in some cases they were so overcrowded that it was like being in a club, like sardined in there and just sort of trying to make it as much as it could. Thanks to the anonymity of mask and costume, the voluptuaries of masquerade were free to engage in otherwise taboo behavior. Not only was verbal intimacy with strangers encouraged, but a new liberated language of gesture arose. Impromptu touching, shoving, and embracing were part of the exemplary liberty of the occasion. Women, notably, were free. So when we're imagining either being a masquerade in different types of roles, the rules are quite extraordinary, because, and we're going to be talking a little bit about this towards the end as well, but it's just that women could only go to church by themselves, and then suddenly the masquerade was a place that they could go unaccompanied, and where they were encouraged to go and experiment, have fun, meet people, various things. But yes, so I think we can, last things, just look at the background of this illustration, how highly decorated it is, the kind of stucco work, because that's all part of the Rococo style, which we are going to be talking about in reference. Let me check that I've got, yeah. So to bring it back to the Molly, I've got this quote from the book again, from Richter Norton, which is the Bible on the subject matter. I'm going to try and move my thing, because right now, yeah, here we go. So obviously in this illustration here, we're not seeing a Molly, but we're seeing a wealthy woman dressed in some fancy dress. However, we've got an incident that has been recorded of Mollies returning from a ball in London, arrested and wearing female garments. So they were in female masquerade dress, gowns, petticoats, head clothes, fine laced shoes, furbelow scarves, masks, and complete dresses for women. Others had riding hoods. Some were dressed like shepherdesses, other like milkmaids with fine green hats, waistcoats, and petticoats. And others had their faces painted and patched, and very extensive whoop petticoats, which were then very lately introduced. So we've looked at the map, we've looked at the places, and now we've got this satirical image of a woman who's basically too drunk to keep herself up in the seat. And perhaps we can imagine a similar situation at the time when the Mollies were sadly arrested, though. So, about the masquerade and the influences of the masquerade that the moralist of the time was so against. The masquerade was imported, as we said, from France and from Italy, in particular from Venice. In Venice, at this point, women, for example, had quite a lot of liberty and had been allowed to be wandering around places by themselves, which is not something that happens anymore by the end of the century. And the English aristocracy and the richest members of society of England would have actually traveled to Italy and Europe as part of their grand tour. I've always found this fascinating. As an Italian who studied English literature at some point, I remember reading about like these English aristocrats who would just spend years traveling and admiring and painting and learning, and maybe just like using the space which perhaps was quite cheap at the time compared to England, and just making the most of it. But here we've got the first image. I want to show you why one of the environments that some of these rich aristocrats would have perhaps been in. That's a ridotto, and as you can see, women are wearing very small black masks, and men are wearing Venetian bouters. In the background and on the floor, you can see there's cards. This is a gambling space. Now, people in Venice didn't just wear masks for the masquerades or for the Carnivale. They wore masks also to keep anonymity and to save the reputations when gambling or when playing games or getting involved in whatever society judged as not acceptable, respectable. And I thought it was interesting to look at the mask, again, going back to the artifacts and the craftsmanship that is linked to the mollies, is like the beauty of the ceramics of these masks. Now, the Bauta is fascinating because it was probably the most popular Venetian mask in Venice, specifically because it allows for eating and drinking. So you could have it on, and because the mouthpiece is so far away, you could spend your whole night having fun with your ceramic decorated mask. But it was the most practical for this reason. Women, which you see in this image as wearing this tiny little mask, almost looks like they've painted their faces black, but actually they were like tiny masks that they would hold in place with a little button on the mouthpiece. So I'm not sure how they dealt with communication in this. I only found out about this yesterday as I was reading about like the development of masks through this type of like this century and the century after. But I also wanted to add another image of a woman wearing a mask in fancy dress, basically, mostly because, yes, there's a load of paintings of women in fancy dress at this point. And we know that all of those women who have been painted in fancy dress were rich women. So it's not that relevant, I think, for this conversation today, but the only thing that I wanted to show is paying attention to the garments. So this is a woman who's actually wearing a military-inspired male jacket and a sort of oriental-inspired garment on top of it, and one of those little black masks. So this would have been called dressing up at the time, and this is because for a woman to dress up a man like a man, it was basically dressing up as a person who had a higher social status. So I just found an image and I thought that was like a fascinating thing to show. Let's see. Right, so now we're going to talk about Rococo, which I think is super linked with the mollies, even if like I cannot talk about it as extensively as it would be interesting too. But the main reason is that Rococo was a style imported from France, which was all the rage in France, but also it was a style that was created by craftsmen, not by architects. Now, if you think about how in society there's been a huge divide in the hierarchies of taste, with certain taste being for the higher classes versus lower classes, versus also a certain idea of control over taste, Rococo was the most rebellious of styles for this reason. It was so because it was highly ornamental, it was very theatrical, and some of the balls that we have imagined, or like I've showed you some of the illustrations, would have had this style going on. And why does it matter, as well as the fact that it's interesting to look at it? Because probably some of the mollies, some of the men, some of the women who were tradesmen and maybe were connected in some way or the other were actually the people who were producing and making these pieces that would have like decorated the places where the mollies worked or worked. I really like Rococo, specifically because everybody's so into minimalism. I'm like, why can't we just have, as a maker, someone who enjoys discovering like how to make certain things? I actually think there's a lot of creativity that goes into this attention to detail. In England, anyway, just going back to Rococo here and how it worked as well. So in England, it was a bit more toned down compared to how rich and popular it was, say, in the north of Italy and France. And the way the taste spread was through the publishing of basically manuals that had loads of designs that people could go, I want that one, or can I have this one a little bit more this way, and etc. So that's why I've added some of these images in the center, because that's exactly 2 pages of probably the most important manual of the time, which was compiled by Thomas Chippendale, which is, according to my research, the most important furniture maker, designer of the time. And what he did, he compiled this directory and then would have been distributed to anyone who wanted to recreate this type of style. So yes, the other thing that I wanted to add about Rococo in a very kind of like flash course on what it looked like and maybe what it would have felt like to be in a space like that is also that little silver candlestick, candle holder. And I've got a quote for that because it first appeared in England. So Rococo first appeared in England in silver and engravings of ornament in the 1730s, with immigrant artists and craft people, including Huguenot refugees from France, such as Paul de la Mairie, playing a key role in its dissemination. Now, we know that the Huguenots refugees were based in East London, Spitalfields, and we know they were great craftsmen. And they also link a little bit with the Masquerade because later on I'm going to be talking about the trade that were involved in the Masquerade and the kind of East London scene that existed at the time. But it is interesting to know that, you know, immigrants as well as the aristocracy brought in craft. It's not just, it wasn't just like, you know, from the top down to some extent, even if, you know. However, here we are. we're in East London. Let me see if we've got any quotes that I'd like to read to you before we start talking about this. Oh yes, I just wanted to add one thing about like the opinions that the public / the press and media of the time had, because another thing that was interesting about trying to find information about the Masquerade was how self-reflective this society has started to become. And that is because of the advent of the media and the printing technologies becoming much faster, allowing for greater production of material, whether it was satire, etchings, engravings, and the fact that these are much cheaper than paintings. So yes, there's still these are products that are still serving the wealthier side of society, but it's tradesmen who are sort of making these etchings and working together. But the reason, one second, the quote I had was about a sermon preached to the Society for the Reformations of Manners, which we have mentioned already in one of the previous Zooms, because of how much they were absolutely against the Molly's houses. So in the eyes of moralists of the time, the 18th century mass assembly indicated the degree to which national taste had succumbed to perverse foreign fashion and signaled an imminent giving over of the population, male and female, to luxury and profaneness. This was part of the sermon that was given, I think, by the bishops in 1724, and it was published in the Gentleman's Magazine for September 1771. So we can see how the press here is having a strong role in kind of developing ideas of taste or opinions on people's ways of living. But yes, so now we're back in East London. Petticoat Lane sign there. It's a road that actually existed. I think this is a fictional sign, but it's still really interesting to know that, you know, the East and the West at this point were very much connected because of trade. And some of the beautiful fabrics, furnishings, weaving, and ceramics and other artifacts of the time were actually made in these parts of London. And as we have mentioned before, the Molly houses tended to be close to where the tradesmen worked and lived, specifically because these were people, like, you know, these were people of the lower classes, so they kind of like lived and occupied spaces next to each other, yet traveled or had businesses, say near Clerkenwell or Monument, which I have a little story of a milliner who actually was really successful and had her own shop near Monument. And that was a good location, because the more you are in between the two sides, the more you're connected with the people who are producing the materials or the stock, or, like, you know, the artifacts, and those who then you're selling them to through a shop or brick and mortar type of place. Now, so I'm half French, half Italian, so I was quite interested to see like how at this point there were in Spitalfield 25,000 Huguenots already living, and by the end of the century it's already 50,000. I've showed you a little artifact earlier which showed the level of craftsmanship that these people had, and here I've got an image which is a weaver in Spitalfield Cottage. And I've got more images who try to give a little bit more of an idea of the spaces that in which these items would have been produced. So I think I can't remember if it's Hogarth again, but let's just not be judgmental about it, but just look a little bit at the space, at the fact that we've got a system. It's a small workshop, so that's another thing that is interesting about the Mollys and the time of the Mollys. At this point, production is quite small. There's small workshops, there's small, the teams are small. Sometimes people lived and worked in the same places. They would have had a shop, at the bottom, and maybe something lived on the top. And you can see the reference to Spitalfields because of a cup on the left-hand side that says Spitalfields. And of course, it's still going to be a moralist commentary on the time, but I think to me it was just interesting to see the production, the space for production. Let's see if I've got a quote about this. No, let's go next. Right, so I loved finding this image because, again, I've been trying to imagine what it was like to work and to live in London at the time of the Mollys, and I'm interested in production, in making as an artist as well. So here we can see, for example, how they would have worked, you know, to make those costumes for the masquerade, to make those garments. That's a team of tailors. This image is showing men, and it was still mostly men who were tailors, but there were women who had different jobs as seamstresses, and it worked slightly differently. But, you know, in this image we're looking at men. We can see the intimacy of it, and there's other things that from a social point of view to me are interesting. The importance of that big window. Like, if you're a tailor, if you are a seamstress, if you're making garments or working in textiles, or your work requires a lot of precision, if you don't have light, you're not going to be able to work. So basically, you wouldn't be able to succeed at having a good trade. So you can see they're all drinking. They've got all their caps as well. I think they might be drinking ale, meaning that at this time it was actually quite common to be working, drinking ale before you go to the tavern, maybe. I think it's quite interesting. And then, yeah, what does this image say? Yes, so the author of this image is anonymous, but it seems to be that it was London, and anyway, this was the start for many other places. And this is another interesting space for me, because this would have been basically a dressmaker shop. How different these spaces are. On one level, we've got the workshop where the weaving is happening, and then you've got the place where the tailors are sewing, and this is the place where you would go and buy your garments / your materials, you know. And it's in this image, it's all women, but I'm going to show you one where there's men as well. And I think it's quite contemporary to some extent. Yes, the style is probably this kind of Rococo style, but you can see almost like how all the women who are working there, and it's quite a big team, are all wearing a uniform. And you can see the women who are shopping, who are like kind of trying out things, touching things. Maybe they're preparing, maybe they're choosing how they're going to dress up for the masquerade at some point. Or maybe not, but it's all linked together. I found that as I was thinking about the masquerade, it wasn't just about the masquerade in itself. It was also everything that existed around the masquerade. Right, so here I've got another image. I think last time when Lou was talking about costume, she talked briefly about the macaronis and the phenomenon of the macaronis in terms of like style. And as the macaronis were quite elaborate in both how they moved, how they spoke, and what they wore, and the makeup and everything, for me it was really interesting to see that the women have this kind of blushed cheeks, and so do the men, you know, who knows. And that's a milliner's shop. So milliners had, I think that basically milliners, from my research, if you worked in textiles, it was great to have a business, but it wasn't that easy. Like, you know, it required a lot of work. And through some of the essays that I've read and some of the conversations we've had also with Alex in one of the first Zooms, there was a strong link between perhaps like sometimes doubling into more than just one profession, and maybe also perhaps having phases in your life where you were a sex worker or at the time a prostitute, and maybe other times later on you managed to have a shop. And so identities are not so fixed. It's not like that the milliners were milliners forever. There was this idea, there was this like difficulty in society that is like kind of becoming a little bit more and more similar to capitalism as we understand it now. And that means that the security of a tradesperson wasn't necessarily guaranteed. So there was a closeness, I think, between milliners and the Mollys and London.
Right. No, sorry, just to interrupt you. Arkham was like, love the names on the boxes of that image.
Yes, love.
Feathers, love.
Yes, yeah. I also looked at it, I was like, in that box, I can find love. But yes, it could be, for example, that could be, I haven't looked too much into this image, but you know, from some of the essays I've read, there's some plays, for example, loads of plays that were put in place, sometimes had as a stage set, a milliner's shop or a tailor shop. And it seems like there were records of how sometimes a milliner's shop, a textile shop was also perhaps like also a place where people could have sex with each other. Right, so the next photo is a bit of a little parenthesis that I've added to this presentation, specifically because I, as a medium, as an artist, I focus on embroidery or like using threads and stitching. And when I kind of started using it, I was really curious to learn more about the history of embroidery. And at this point in history, a few changes are about to happen. So embroidery was, I'd say, always a bit of a sign of wealth and status, specifically because it's decorative. And the role that embroidery has had in the world, or even just English society, is quite complex to summarize right now. But what interests me about this point is that when embroidery is done by a laborer, it's not really been considered of much value, as in it's not as expensive as perhaps it should have been or should be. But when embroidery was done by an aristocrat or a woman of wealth, it suddenly was this like amazing activity and the most noble possible activity they could possibly engage with. And at this point in history, well, not at this point, in this point in history, embroidery is still being hand stitched and manufactured, because the 18th century is a time for like a thriving manufacturing what's the word? A thriving manufacturing time. But with the advent of the machine and the kind of like, with the boundaries between masculinity and femininity becoming stronger, what happens is embroidery becomes deprofessionalized to some extent, and becomes an activity that is like recommended for the genteel woman rather than as a profession. And I thought, when we look at this garment here, which probably would have been worn at court, it wouldn't necessarily been worn at a masquerade. It's just interesting when we're talking about dress and cross-dressing and the masquerade and the kind of exploration of like boundaries between like gender and the expression of gender, how even the act of embroidering kind of changes as we go towards the end of this century and
so,
Victorian time.
sorry, just to understand, when it was done, would it have been done by men? So we saw the images in the tailors,
Yeah.
with a group of men. So would embroidery have been done by men before it became like a
Yes, my understanding of embroidery, specifically from the Middle Ages to this point, is that it wasn't gendered in the past. Actually, it was the church that started to try and have a lot of control over women's design and creativity. And this had already been happening for quite a while. So what probably would have happened is men would have designed the design, women would have embroidered it. So there's a lot of control already that is slowly changing, and that is, this time is about to change even more so. So that's why I wanted to mention it. I also want to mention something else about milliners and the kind of trade that involved textiles and clothes making, because I was reading an article about what it would have been like for people working the textile manufacturing and making of garments. If you imagine that thousands of people were attending weekly masquerades and events, and that all of these garments were handmade, like the amount of hours of work required, sometimes with strict deadlines, was, when I imagine it, was like quite insane. And people were working really long hours, and there was a hierarchy as well on who would get as much, like who would get light, like how much light they would get to be able to stitch in the evenings throughout the night, sometimes with having just 2 hours of sleep if there were deadlines. And I've got a quote here. So here's a description of the division of light amongst the lace makers. You know, we're in East London, we've got the Huguenots, we've got the weavers. We know that this is something that is relevant. The three-legged stool, candle block, candle stool, or pour-board are alternative names upon which the candle and the water-filled magnifying flasks are fitted. And was placed in the middle of the room. The lace workers then arrange themselves around the light in an orderly manner that allows each person to have at least some of the light. The best lace makers use the highest stools and are nearest to the light source. They have what is known as the first light. Then the graded workers arrange themselves according to ability to have the second light and the third light. Whiting tells us that in this way, 18 lace makers can be accommodated around the candle stool. Yeah. So a little bit about the working conditions of these workshops in East London and other places. In the article I read, they were actually trying to recreate the same experiment, and some of the people who wrote the article were like, I don't even know how anyone with a second light would have been able to do any work on precision. So wow, craftsmanship, I'd say. Right, so we're getting towards the end of the presentations. I've tried to zoom out from London and try to go closer and closer and closer to perhaps the kind of like spaces and worlds and work these people would have been involved with. And now there's more about what was so exciting about the masquerade as well. So let's have a look. So, as we mentioned earlier, the masquerade was a place where a woman can go unescorted. And part of the excitement and part of what is exciting even for us now is that it was almost a place of gender fluidity, in the sense that men could be dressed as women, women could be dressed as men, the classes could also be mixed. Some of the researchers I've read have described it as organized systematic anarchy, which it's basically like a space where for that amount of time, for that transient moment, the rules of society can be forgotten. And maybe if we're imagining this as part of queer history, it was a place where perhaps expression would have been, there would be an opportunity for expression, an opportunity to explore and experiment on these roles. The other thing that I've been interesting in reading about the Masquerade is the fact that there's a strong link between the macaronis and the Masquerade. The macaronis, I've got this little porcelain here. There's quite a few images on the macaronis, and Lou mentioned them last time, so I'm not going to talk too much about them. But the reason I want to connect the Masquerade, the macaroni, and the kind of cross-dressing and transvestism that the Masquerade and this period are starting to explore, even if they haven't just started. I suppose this is an interesting time of change, of shifting, I guess. So yes, macaroni in this image, it's a piece of ceramic. So I've been looking at artifacts, and I was interested in finding artifacts that show a connection also with East London again, and with the Mollies. So these ceramics actually was produced in Bow. So, and not only was produced in Bow, so we've got a little bit of a reference to do with where these items were being made, but we also have a little bit about the culture, because this man who is impersonating a macaroni, so isn't a macaroni, he's impersonating a macaroni, is an actor. So it's a little bit like having celebrity culture at this point. That's the thing that I found really interesting, that the Masquerade and the costume and the dress and the theatre and the style is constantly reflecting on ideas of on identity and on roles that masculine and feminine, on roles that either consider masculine or feminine. Mm-hmm. In this case, when I look at it, it's funny because when I look at it, I don't straight away see the extravagance of the garment. But when I was reading about it, the fact that the jacket is so stiff is apparently one of the kind of indirect references to perhaps the more effeminate but masculine, mixed masculine and feminine element of it. So yes, so going back to the Masquerade and the macaroni and East London and the kind of gender, the kind of particular example of gender fluidity that the Masquerade offered, there's also to say that effectively up to this moment, based on my research, they had, like, gender was fluid. There was a, you know, even like during Roman times and up to this moment, you know, being homosexual wasn't an identity. What was being prosecuted was an action. Mm-hmm. And therefore, like, what some of the moralists expected was not a denying of men's attraction towards other men, but more like that they wanted to control it, and they wanted the church and the state to kind of like have control over something that up to this moment had existed, and perhaps people hadn't paid much attention to it. And yes, so I've got a couple of images, and the Masquerade was interesting because there were quite flamboyant, extravagant episodes at this point. I have, for example, I've got some references on how much the writers of the time focused on the Masquerade in their books, and I'm going to read those quotes as well. And I also have a couple of recorded episodes where people were perhaps exploring the Masquerade and the I think I'm going to say that wrong. Licentiousness. Wait, did you say it?
I can't say it
You
myself.
don't know what we mean. It's like the possibility of transgression of taboos and exploring things, but it's a very difficult
I'm
word.
just going to say it's 3 o'clock. My daughter's coming back in 15 minutes, so we have to
Right.
stop before then. But should we give it another 10 minutes?
Yes, I'm just gonna read a quote about the masquerade and a quote about people. So the masquerade diffused a novel spirit of sensual liberty, disguise and anonymity, granted a license for erotic experimentation. Interestingly enough, contemporary accounts suggest that those persons most often singled out by the anti-masquerade writers are as likely to indulge in the masquerade debaucheries, women certainly, but also in more coded ways. Homosexuals may indeed have found at the masked assembly unusual opportunities for sexual expression. There's so much to read about the masquerade on this topic. I really enjoyed researching it. I feel like I've only just dipped my toes in it. But yes.
Great. Have you finished? Amazing. Well done, Milou. Really good.
I've got about
Very
another 30
interesting.
quotes.
Thank you so much, Milou. And God, there's so many things. Like there's just obviously just the start of the discussion. Just one of the things that was occurring to me just about also the kind of single sex environment of the workplace. Do you know what I mean? Where people would find companionship, like you're talking about the tailors and the milliners. Do you know what I mean? That environment of men working long hours together and doing something creative, that you can see kind of how a gay subculture has arisen from this as well. But yeah, there's so many fascinating things that
and there was like gay subcultures at this point also in other parts of Europe. And in fact, I was reading about some of the press like blaming Holland as being like one of the forces that had inexplicably brought this type of behavior. Like, yeah, it's kind of it's been really interesting.
I read about Holland as well, because they also had like a reformation of manners.
Yeah,
it was almost harsher than the British one as well, which is really quite interesting.
And I just want to say one last thing about the masquerade as like coming from Italy, because at this point when we had all of these aristocrats traveling to Venice and exploring and doing etc., actually Venice is going through a bit of a crisis, and by the end of the century, the 18th century, with the Napoleonic Wars, the carnival will be completely banned and will not exist again until the 70s. So really interesting attitude towards the masquerade and what it meant in society.
Right. Okay, I just want to say, so we won't keep everybody forever, that this is, hang on, let me just turn you onto more of a normal screen. This is going to be the last Zoom that we're going to do in the summer. So thank you all for coming to all the Zooms. It's been really good. It's been really interesting, actually, obviously, to spend the lockdown researching 18th century mollies. And I'm really glad that we've started lots of conversations, and from September, when we're allowed to meet, it will be really interesting to follow that on. And we're very lucky as well that with St. Margaret's House as an arts institution or a community arts institution, that we're allowed for this to happen as well. And there will be, from September, we're going to have walks. There's going to be obviously social distancing measures in place, and there's going to be limits on the amount of people that are allowed to attend both the walks and the workshops. But the next thing I will be doing is going to be sending out details about everything that we've got coming up from September to Christmas. And September is all going to be, or majoritively going to be outside doing walks. So we're going to have Dan de la Motte doing molly houses around central London. We're going to have Yvonne Taylor doing Black History. We're going to have sex worker tours. We're going to have trans identity as well. And then we're also going to be, myself and Nina Scott, who's another theatre maker, is going to be kind of continuing this conversation about the history of the mollies, but also in terms using arts techniques and theatre techniques from Theatre of the Oppressed, and also using broadside ballads to really explore the relevance of this history and the relevance to now and the contemporary mollies. We've also got some really cool stuff. We've got a weekend where we're going to making puppets using sex toys, and that's going to be called Creatures of Intimacy. That will be really good with Sean Kidd. We're going to be hopefully going to be able, we still have to check about whether they're going to be open, but exploring the archives as well and doing more work with Matt. And also we're going to be doing a puppet, we're going to do some poetry writing, so some erotic sex poetry writing workshops as well. So you'll be able to sign up for all this. They will all be free to attend, but the numbers will be limited. So that will be, I shall be sending that out by the end of the month. Also, finally, just wanted to say, if any of you have got any feedback for us or any requests or things, you know, comments or things that you might have enjoyed or things that you think that we should explore more of, because we have been doing the 18th century at a breakneck speed as well. So I realise we've skimmed a lot of stuff. Please send me some feedback as well so we can work out how to tailor this more to you. Stuart, do you want to say something? Yeah.
We've got forms, haven't we, as well, that we'll be sending out. Yeah. So please fill them out, because we have to report back to the Heritage Lottery, and they love a good bit of data. So any feedback, people, that is amazing.
Milou?
I just wanted to say that I found a BBC record interview of Victor Norton talking about the Mollies that it would be really cool to send you as well.
I'll send that as well. And yeah, and if you've got any recommendations of books and things, just send me them and I'll put them on the emails. Has anybody else got any comments or anything before we go?
Milou, thank you so much. That was light speed. My brain is still buzzing so much. Also, thank you for recommending the book Woman's Work, First 20,000 Years, because that's been really...
Oh, yes!
Yeah, I've been reading that recently, and it's been really...
How amazing was the part where they talked about the marriages, where the women like sold the fabrics and the men traveled around the world just making...
I haven't got there yet. I think I'm only 3 or 4 chapters in. So I'm really excited, even doubly now. Yeah. I thought it was very interesting, the stuff we were talking about in terms of the press's treatment of things, because as we're living this now, the press are always, you know, if there's a subculture going on in East London now, the press are 20 years behind when they start throwing shade at us, and we've been doing it, so it probably reveals a lot. The press was starting to speak about something, but also the kind of the importing of European, particularly Italian and French culture, and this very British kind of dichotomy of people really fetishizing it, but also kind of slandering it and hating it as well, which seems to have always happened.
Yeah.
This all brought to mind, actually, I don't know if anyone else has heard or gone to the Sex Maniacs Ball, which is kind of still going to today, but it was very big in the 80s and 90s. And it's started by, or certainly co-founded by, someone called Tuppy Owens, who runs a charity connecting disabled people with each other for dating, but also with sex workers. And they would throw the Maniacs Ball as a place for queers, straight people who were more polyamorous or were into kind of more orgiastical sex, and also disabled people to all be under one roof, basically able to meet each other and have fun and be sensual and potentially date or see each other afterwards. So it, you know, reminds me, I'm obviously clubbing culture in general, and Heaven and GAY, you know, for better and worse, you know, to this day are those spaces where we can have those freedoms. So it's really interesting to trace how much basically party culture has afforded us, and always been so prohibited and always so hypocritically.
Yeah.
And also what you were talking about in terms of kind of conceptions of gender before criminalization, or there being more fluidity. Obviously Roman times are quite famous, and Greek times perhaps over famous for things, or over idealized as well. But when the criminalization of homosexuality new laws came in Russia a few years ago, my Russian friends were telling me the most interesting part for them about that was, well, normally these laws always target men, because there's an invisibilization of lesbians as just not existing, or woman on woman sex just not being a thing, which is already very interesting and painful. But also in Russia, it seems that there was no laws around homosexuality, because on the one hand, maybe it just happened and no one talked about it, but on the other hand, people didn't even conceive that it was possible, or that in Russia we don't have that problem. Is the way my queer friend from Russia described it.
Just on that point though, I think there is actually quite a long history of homophobia since, particularly in England, since Edward II, if Claire's still here, one of them, as we did this play on a Masters, was partly the fear was the fact of having another political opponent sharing a bedchamber with a king. Do you know what I mean? Where a woman had no power, no political power, was likely illiterate, whereas a man who's in a private space with another powerful man was a political threat. And so there was a strong history of that homophobia being also about politics as well.
Victor Norton was also talking about the fact that because men's semen is considered almost sacred, it was partly the fear of like the semen not going for procreation purposes. But it's in the interview as well. But it is really interesting, really, really interesting.
Oh, it's great. Anyone else? Arkham, are you waving goodbye or say hello?
No, I'm giving jazz hands in celebration. But also, yeah, just to say what I've really loved with all of these talks is like the way so many themes like weave together. And yeah, one of the things that I was reminded of today is, well, or linked up with is, of course, when you showed us the picture of the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, and I was trying to sort of work out where the Vauxhall Tavern is. I think it's like the corner of those buildings, and you know, Ducky is still rolling, and they did this thing called Lady Malcolm's Servants' Balls just a couple of years ago, which was a recreation of these 1920s 30s balls where servants would go and dress up as the lords and ladies, and it was really underground, and then Ducky like recreated those. And then it also reminds me of the Harlem drag balls that I've been hearing about lately, which was like the birth of voguing, and yeah, like so many things are bubbling. It's great.
Yes, I really loved looking at all of this. There's more images. I was trying to find loads of images of different parts of London and what they look like and it would have been like to be there. So cool. Yeah, thanks.
That's a really good point. We should reach out to the ballroom community in London for when we launch in person.
Yeah.
Okay, are we good? Okay,
I'm good.
all right. Lovely to see you all. Thank you all so much for kind of sharing this experience, and I look forward to seeing you all in person in September. Okay, so yeah, so thanks you all for coming. Okay, and
hello, Nola.
Say hello to everyone.
Hello.
Okay, so yeah, all right, so I'll see you all in September. Okay, have a good summer, everybody.
Save the conversation.
Thanks, Milou. Thanks, Ray. Bye.
Bye.